Have you ever tried painting birch tree trunks only to have them end up looking stiff and unnatural? Have you tried masking fluid to keep the whites of the trunks until you can paint the bark, only to get those annoying blobs at the bottom of the trunks, essentially ruining the painting? Well, I've struggled with this too until I came up with this dual technique method that solves both problems. When you try to paint around these drawn birch tree trunks, it's difficult. It's negative painting, and you could make a mistake and paint over the line into the tree trunk. A lot of artists don't like negative painting for this reason, and still they can end up looking stiff and unnatural. And masking fluid? Those blobs at the bottom of the trunks are why a lot of artists just give up on masking fluid entirely. They say it's just not worth the trouble. But what if I told you there was a way to use both masking tape and masking fluid to solve both problems strategically, and a simple trick to eliminate those blobs at the bottom of your tree trunks when using masking fluid? Let me show you how. So here's why this dual technique works. Number one, you tear the tape and so you get a soft edge that's very natural. Plus, once you put your tape down, you can pick it up and reposition it if you need to. Now, with masking fluid, you're committed, but there's still some flexibility there. I know what you're thinking. You just talked about those annoying blobs at the bottoms of the tree trunks. Why would I even try that? Well, there is a way to deal with them, and I will show you how to do that. I've used these two photos as my inspiration for this fall scene. After drawing the big shapes of the scene on the watercolor paper, I'm tearing the tape into shapes of tree trunks. What I'm first doing is I'm tearing one side, and then what that leaves me with is a jagged edge, so I have a natural looking side of a tree trunk. I take the thin side that's left over from tearing it into two pieces, and I use it for some of the distant trees. For this larger tree, I ended up using two pieces of tape so that I could have jagged edges on both sides. Notice how in a lot of these pieces of tape, I only have one side that's jagged. The other side is just straight. I was a little worried at first to see if it would turn out, but let's see how it goes. Once I have all the pieces of tape laid down, I looked at it and I said, I don't think this is going to really do enough to show those distant trees because the lines are kind of fine. So I had to think about what I was going to do to solve that. Decided that I was going to use my fine liner masking fluid. This is a great way to create fine lines, and in this case, I'm using it to depict those distant tree trunks. Now that the masking fluid is dry, I'm ready to lay in the first wash, which is the distant mountains. I'm going to use this Fuumuui brush. It's a size 10 round. I'm using a combination of Cobalt blue and Perylene maroon, plus a little touch of burnt sienna to give a little variation in the color of the distant mountains. And I'm just painting right over the tape, right over the masking fluid. Now what my plan was that once I get the mountains laid in, that I would drop in yellow ochre and that it would diffuse into the mountains. Well, it didn't work. So I had to think of something else I could do. You can see some spots where it's diffused just a little bit, but it's not enough. It just looks like a plain of dried grass. In the meantime, I was thinking about solutions. I thought, well, let me go ahead and start bringing the color forward. And these are mostly the light values that you'd see. And these are supposed to be the leaves that have dropped from the trees in the fall. Now, if you've noticed in the fall, a lot of times, even though the trees are mostly bare, there's still bits of grass that are on the ground next to trees. And in this case, we'll see some of it that's next to the banks of the river. And here I'm dropping in some dark color, similar gray that I use for the mountains to depict some rocks that are at the banks of the river. The green I'm using is Serpentine Genuine. I'm coming in with a little bit of burnt sienna to increase a little bit of the value of the color on the floor of the woods. But those ended up not working out very well, so you'll see later on what I decided to do about that. Now I'm painting the sky. This is a combination of cobalt blue and a little bit of manganese blue hue. So the problem here is that you can't see the tree trunks. So I have to have something around the masking tape and the masking fluid so that you can tell that there are trees there. Still, I was concerned about there being enough contrast between the sky and the tree trunks, so I darkened it up. Now for the river. What do you do when you need to depict a river? Well, the river reflects the sky, and the sky, as you look up, gets darker as you move away from the horizon. The river then acts like a mirror. That's the solution. So you paint a gradient with your darkest color at the bottom of the scene and then lighten up that gradient as you go up the page. One of the nice things about gradients is as long as they're still wet, you can continue to drop more value into them if that's what you need, and that's what I did here. I'm going to try to fix this. I'm first going to try to re-wet this and get the paint to flow. If that doesn't work, I'll actually come back in with the magic eraser and try to scrub out a little bit of the lower part of this mountain range and then paint in a suggestion of trees with these warm colors. The best way to scrub out color is to use some kind of a stiff brush. And this is a golden Taklon, and let me hold it here, a golden Taklon, and this is well used. So the golden Taklon, you can use it for watercolor, but it has a fairly stiff brush. So it gives you the ability to move paint around a little bit more easily than if you were using, say, a Kolinsky sable, which can be fairly soft. So I'm in here. You can see that the paint is softening. I have some yellow ochre mixed up, ready to go. So I'm dampening my brush, wetting the paint that's on the paper, dabbing my brush on my towel to remove the pigment that's in the brush, And the way I'm using the brush is a back and forth and an up and down movement to try to lift that pigment. And it's lifting a little bit, a little bit. Because yellow ochre is a semi-transparent, I think I will be able to simply drop that in and it will cover this. If not, I will go back with a magic eraser. So here's my yellow ochre. Let's start here so we can see what's going on. And it should move up into the wet area. These are typical problems that we face in watercolor, and there's almost always a solution without having to restart the painting. But if you're not feeling confident that you can think of these solutions, or you're starting from scratch, consider joining my school community, Painting with Peggy, where I take you step by step to learn the basics and become a confident watercolor artist in 90 days. Now I'm not getting as much of a coverage here as I'd hoped. You can still see where the mountain was. So a compromise is to use some of that gray color in these distant trees, which might work just fine if they have a little bit of a gray color. So it'd be sort of a warm gray, but if they have a little bit of a gray color, that's going to suggest distance anyway. So I'm going to drop some of that in just to see what that does. And it will also give a little bit of contrast between the birch trees and the rest of what's going on in the background. And I'm not being particular at all. I'm just, I mean, it looks like I'm dabbing, and some teachers in watercolor say, don't dab, don't dab. Well, sometimes I think it's okay. So I'm going to get a little bit more paint for this area that's more visible, because the rest, I think it just won't matter as much. Now I'm going to stop and look at that, because I can see that I'm getting some nice blending of the gray and the yellow ochre right here. I think that's kind of pretty. I'm going to pull this yellow ochre over here down a little bit more, and maybe get a little bit of gray going on in here, just to play with the shadow and the light a little bit. Now I'm taking my wet brush at the bottom of this band of, essentially a wash is what I did, just to try to help prevent a hard edge. Okay, so that's so wet now that I'm not going to be able to get any hard shadows if that's what I'm looking for at the moment. To get the sense of fallen leaves on the woods floor, I'm spattering paint. I'm spattering yellow ochre, Hansa yellow light, and a little bit of burnt sienna. I've waited long enough to deal with these rocks. I don't want them to look like blobs anymore. So here's what I think will work. The sunlight is coming from the left. It's going to strike the rocks on the left and the top, leaving shadow on the right side. So I think that's the trick. Let's see how it goes. Now it's time to take off the masking tape. So, pulling off the masking tape, I'm removing the masking fluid from the paper using a rubber cement lift, and let's see how it looks. When I first removed the masking tape from the paper, the bottoms of the trees have this really hard edge. I knew that was going to happen. What is a solution to that? Well, we know that there's grass growing around these trees. Their leaves have fallen off the trees. And so I can put grass and other color around the bottoms of those trunks to make them blend into the landscape. Now it's a matter of painting in the shadows on the tree trunks and the dark parts of the bark. Well, another problem happened that I didn't anticipate. The shadows are too light. It just doesn't have that pop that I'm looking for. So I had to darken the gray and go back. I had to go back over every tree that I'd already put shadow on. The other thing is that I'm not seeing the shadow meet the right-hand side of the tree. So that can happen, but in this case that's not going to work. Now the one thing good that I can see about putting the shadows on the very thin, distant trees is that as I do that, the little blobs that I got on the masking fluid at the bottom, I'm able to minimize that so it doesn't look blobby. Those shadows just aren't dark enough. I've got to get them darker. So using even a darker gray yet, I'm going over the trees again. My fear is going too dark and it looking contrived somehow. But I decided that I had to go very dark, and I think it's actually working out. And yet there is another problem. The shadow color is a very abrupt transition. It goes white, and then there's a hard edge, and it's dark. Well, round objects don't do that. There's more of a grade between the lightest side and the darkest side. But I had an idea, and that was to take my liner brush and use very, very fine lines over that interface between the white and the dark shadow where the transition is so abrupt, to try to blend those two values in such a way that it tricks the eye and it looks like the tree is round. Well, yet again, there's something that I'm not satisfied with. The tree that's most to the left, but not quite in the foreground, some of the uh, some of the yellow ochre bled through the tape while it was still taped down to the paper. And I mean, these trees are white with some black places on the bark and shadow. But as I was painting it, it occurred to me, that color actually looks kind of good there. It's pulling the other colors from the composition into the trees, and it makes the trees feel like they're part of the rest of the composition. So I decided to play that up, and now I'm putting green and yellow ochre on different parts of the tree trunks throughout the composition. Let me know what you think. Do you think that's effective? It feels like it's adding life to the trees. Watch how I handle the bottoms of the trunks where I had masking fluid. When I put in the shadow color and the grass around the bottoms of the tree trunks, it hides those blobs. You can't even tell they happened. Well, I think it's actually working. I think the way that I'm putting in the dark parts of the bark and the little fine lines that suggest curvature of the trunk, it's actually working. And I think there's a wasp in my studio. With all these problems solved, I can continue to paint in the remaining dark shadows on the trees along with the dark parts of their bark and finish this painting. Well, not so fast. I'm still not happy with the rocks, and I lifted the rock that's towards the bend of the river going towards the right, and I painted it something else, so I think it looks better now. Well, that was quite the journey of trials and tribulations, but I was able to come up with solutions for each of the problems that I faced. Let me know what you think in the comments of the final painting.